We're beginning the 9th through 12th chapter, a brand new setting. As you know, chapters 1 through 8 are quoted most often in the book of Revelation. They're the prophets named, they are dated, obviously post-exilic. But 9 through 14 are very, very different. They're quoted most often in the Gospels. The prophet is not named, and the historical setting is very ambiguous. No dates. There's been a great disagreement about when this refers to. Now, it seems to me that chapters 9 through 14 were written at probably a different time, but I think, of course, by Zechariah, there's some great unity evidence that I have in your outline as far as the use of words and phrases, and you can see that. Your outline is very extensive. Now, this chapter seems to depict, chapter 9, I'm going to do 9 and 10 today, seems to depict God, Yahweh, invading Israel and Judah from the north, because that's the geographical movement of this chapter. Now, he is invading in an eschatological sense, not for judgment, but the reunification and the spiritual salvation of his people. And lo and behold, even these foreign nations, once traditional enemies, are now included in the covenant promise. Oh, what a great passage this really is. There's been much speculation about the date here. One of my favorite commentators is Loophole, and Loophole, he makes the first 10 verses refer to one period, and then he makes 11 and following refer to another. Matter of fact, the first one refers to the conquest of Alexander, that's 1 through 10. Then 11 through the end of the chapter refers to the Maccabean period, primarily because the word Greeks are mentioned in this latter part of the chapter. Now, the Broadman commentary says the Greeks refer to hired mercenaries of the Egyptians and puts the date back in the reign of Josiah, 626 to 609. Well, you can see what divergence of dates we're dealing with. This chapter has a lot of dramatic paradoxes. I want to show them to you before we get into it because it's going to seem very controversial and very confusing. On one hand, it talks about the destruction of these surrounding nations, and on the other of their inclusion in the covenant. It talks about references of peace in verses 8 through 10, but then of a great war going to occur in verses 13 through 15. And finally, it speaks of the first coming of the Messiah in verse 9 and the second coming of the Messiah in verse 10. Now, I must admit, for a historical grammatical exegete like myself, to deal with a passage like this, I feel like pulling my hair out, because I can't lock things down in grammar. It is very prophetic. Now, it's not apocalyptic, but it is prophetic. And the historical setting is very ambiguous, maybe on purpose. It either refers to what happened to Israel and Judah in her past, what was currently happening, or the exile also, the past glories, the exile, and then the current resettlement after the exile. Some see the Maccabean period, some see the Roman period, some see an eschatological period. Maybe it's ambiguous to fit all ages. But we can be real dogmatic on a lot of the pieces. Let's look at chapter 9. The burden of the word of the Lord. Now, it seems that 9 through 11 is a literary unit, and 12 through 14 is a literary unit because of the use of this word burden. This burden, we think, means to lift up. It's usually used in the sense of judgment, to lift up one's voice, but it's sometimes used in the sense of blessing too, so it's hard to lock it down. Notice where it says, against the land of Hadrach. Now, who is Hadrach? Well, from a 7th century, I think it's 9th century, a 9th century Assyrian stele. This city is mentioned as a covenant partner with the southern city of Damascus. So obviously this refers to the northern reaches of the area of Syria. It seems to be both a city and a geographical area. It seems to be both. Now, with Damascus, now that of course was the capital of the Syrian Empire. You may also see Jeremiah 49, 23 through 27. It was the largest city in that northern area and the capital of Syria. Okay? As a resting place for now. Now, my New American Standard has a parenthesis for the last part of verse 1, and it's very hard to translate. The ASV, and that's what, of course, the NASV follows, for the eyes of the men, especially of all the tribes of Israel, are toward the Lord. Now, that's one real possibility. The Revised Standard Version has, for to the Lord belong the cities of Aram, even as all the tribes of Israel. Now, the Jerusalem Bible is similar to that. But the NAB, the New English Bible has, "For the eyes of the Lord are on all men as on the tribe of Israel." Now that's also in the NIV margin. Now it seems to me what we're saying here is that God is not only concerned with Israel, but with all men. And that seems to be the implication of verse 7, where these foreign enemies are going to be included as a covenant partner of Judah. So I think it's a beautiful and wonderful passage on the universal love of God. What a shocking verse that would have been to the Jews in Zechariah's day. Now, then in verse 2 it mentions Hamath. Now Hamath, in many parts of the Old Testament, is the northern limits of the Promised Land. Now you might well see Numbers 13:21, Joshua 13:5, and I believe it's Job 3:3 for those references, okay? Then it says, also, which borders on Tyre and Sidon. Now Tyre and Sidon were the Phoenician coastal cities. We think the Phoenicians and the Philistines were the same racial group from the Aegean Islands. The Philistines tried to invade Egypt around 1200 BC, but were repulsed and settled in southern Palestine. But these two, Tyre and Sidon, became commercial maritime powers, okay? Quite early, the king of Tyre helped Solomon in building the temple, but later on he became a real thorn in the side to Judah later on. Now, notice where there's a play on the words Tyre and the word fortress in verse 3. By the way, let me go back to verse 2 and simply say that they were traditionally very, very wise. Now, there's not a whole lot of reference in the Bible, but that seems to be the current tradition in the Near East that we're talking about. You might want to see for their commercial power Ezekiel 28. And also their pride in their wisdom and commercial power and their fortress city. And that's what I'm getting to in verse 3. Tyre is the Hebrew word S-O-R. Fortress is the Hebrew word M-A-S-O-R. Now, Tyre was an island city. There was an old Tyre and a new Tyre. The new Tyre was on an island half a mile offshore. Now, many people had tried to conquer this island. We have records of Sennacherib, Esarhaddon, Ashurbanipal, Salmaneser. Many of those for 5 years plus besieged Tyre. They took the part that was on the mainland but never took the island fortress. Now, Babylon also besieged this city. For 13 years, Nebuchadnezzar II besieged this city, and it seems to imply in Ezekiel 29:18 he went away empty-handed. But when Alexander the Great came, friends, he leveled it to the ground. 332 BC, took a 7-month siege. He filled in the gap with the rubble from the city on the shore. So that's why many believe that verses 1 through 8, or verses 1 through 9 some, or verses 1 through 10 others, refer to Alexander the Great's invasion in around the 330s. Seems to fit his story because all these cities were destroyed, but Jerusalem wasn't. Now it's either that setting or it's a foreshadowing an eschatological event, I think. Now, notice where it mentions, and he piled up silver like dust. That's an allusion to the commercial wealth of Tyre and Sidon, I believe. Verse 4. Behold, the Lord will dispossess her and cast her wealth into the sea. We know Alexander did that. He leveled it through all the debris in the sea, burned it with fire. Look at the next verse. Now in verse 5, these first 4 verses are northern Israel, but 5 through 8 deals with the middle areas or the southern areas of the Promised Land. Notice the 4 of the 5 Philistine cities, Ashkelon, Gaza, Ekron, and Ashdod. Gath is left out. She's also left out in some other prophecies, which may be why she's left out here, or she may have been destroyed early and was no longer a real sinner. And we know from the book of Ezra and Nehemiah that this whole area was known as the Ashdodites, and they were against the people of God in rebuilding the temple. Now, notice it says, Gaza too will writhe in great pain. Well, this is a metaphor for a woman in childbirth, which speaks of a destruction. We know from Joshua 15:45 through 47 that Ekron, Ashdod, and Gaza were part of the inheritance of Judah, of course, but were never fully conquered. Now in verse 6, we have, and a mongrel race will dwell in Ashdod. This mongrel race is the idea of these, like Assyria and Babylon, deporting the people and bringing others in. The rabbis even use this term for a child of a Jew and a pagan. Okay? Now in verse 6, this B, we have a change. Mine has, and I will cut off the pride of the Philistines. It's a change from the third person to the first person. This is very common in prophetic literature where God begins to speak for himself in the first person through his prophet. And I will remove their blood from their mouth. That's verse 7. And that seems to imply that God's going to change their godless abominations, the drinking of blood, the offering of sacrifices to idol, into kosher food laws. This is the first reference to the idea they're going to be converted and included in the covenant people. Notice where it says, and their detestable things from between their teeth, and they will also be a remnant for our God, and be like the clan of Judah. Oh my goodness! Ashdod is going to quit her idolatry and come to the Lord. Look Ekron. And Ekron will be like a Jebusite. Now the Jebusite was the ancient city that David finally captured, where we believe that Melchizedek was priest-king during Abraham's day, and the modern city, of course, is Jerusalem. Now, you might want to see 2 Samuel 24:16 and 1 Chronicles 21:18 for an allusion to that city. So it seems that Ekron, or Philistia, is going to be included as Syria will in the covenant people. Isn't that striking? Now, Philo said this referred to Acts 8:26 through 40, because it never was fulfilled historically, because the Philistines ceased to exist. So Philo says it's a New Testament allusion. Seems like to me, since we can't fulfill it historically, it's got to be New Testament or it's got to be eschatological. Now, listen, God promises, because of him who passes by and returns. That's obviously to the repeated invasions of Palestine. And no oppressor will ever pass over them anymore. Here's God in a militaristic sense saying, I'm going to be on your side. I'm going to fight for you. No oppressor will ever invade the land anymore. Well, if you know history, you know this can't be fulfilled historically, because Israel was continued to be invaded, finally by the Romans, and many since then, the Muslims, and on and on. Now, notice where it mentions, verse 9, rejoice greatly, imperative, O daughter of Zion. This rejoice greatly, you might want to see Zechariah 2:10 and Zephaniah 3:14 and 15 for the same kind of imperative. It seems a war cry over the joy of Yahweh's victory. Now, the daughter of Zion is a title of many post-exilic books which speaks of the intimate relationship between the people of God and God. And I think that's very true. Now, it's usually used in a judgmental passage, though. Verse 5c, behold, your king is coming to you. Now, the ideal of Yahweh as king is nothing new. It may go back to Genesis 49:8 through 12, about that a ruler shall come out of Judah. Many people link it to 1 Samuel 8:7 and 12:12, where Yahweh is considered to be the king of the people of God, but the earthly king is merely his representative. And here's an allusion to that, okay? For he is just and endowed with salvation. Now, both of these words, the ideal of just, meaning God is an ethical God, and you might want to see Isaiah 9:7, 11:4 and 5, 32:1. But he is also a God of deliverance. For the word saved means physical deliverance in the Old Testament, takes on spiritual idea in the New Testament. And there are many allusions to that. Now, these two terms are used together in Isaiah 45:8, 46:13, and 51:4 and 5. So he is ethical and a strong physical deliverer. And, well, that's tremendous. Notice it says he is humble and mounted on a donkey. Now, the word humble really can mean afflicted. You ought to see Zechariah 11, verses 7 and 11, Isaiah 14:32, 51:21, and 54:11. Now, it's a different word in Isaiah 53:7, but the same kind of idea. I think it's an allusion to the suffering servant. Now, the riding on a donkey is very interesting. You realize that a donkey was the royal mount for the kings, both Judea and Israel. We have some allusion to that in Judges 5:10, Judges 10:4, and Judges 12:14. But the fact that it's a colt of the donkey, not only is it was never ridden by anyone, and that's, of course, the royal mount was never ridden by anyone but the king, but being a colt meant it wasn't a war animal, it was a humble sense. And so Jesus certainly fulfilled this as he entered Jerusalem in this way. And that's a beautiful allusion, I think, we find in Mark 14:24. No, excuse me, that's the wrong reference. I'm sorry. I don't have the reference to the New Testament. Look in the margin of your Bible. Now, look at verse 10. And I will cut off the chariot from Ephraim and the horse from Jerusalem, and the war bow will be cut off. And he will speak peace to the nations, and his dominion will be from sea to sea, and the river to the ends of the earth. That sounds universal. I really think verse 9 is the first coming of Jesus, and verse 10 is the second coming of Jesus. Now, it says we'll speak peace to the nations. Notice the universal element here, as it is in verse 13. God's going to bring all the people back to himself. Now, from sea to sea, this either refers to the promised land, as it does in Psalm 72:8, or a universal reign, as it does in Psalm 72:11, where both ideals are picked up on, which may be a good parallel to this ideal here. Now, from sea to sea, if it refers to the Mediterranean and the Dead Sea, may be an allusion to the limits of the promised land. You might well see Exodus 23:31, 1 Kings 4:21. Now, notice where it says, "As for you also, because of the blood of my covenant with you." Now, some say this blood of the covenant refers back to the Abrahamic covenant of Genesis 15:9 through 11. Some say it refers to the Mosaic covenant, Exodus 24:8. We know in Mark 14:24, Jesus used this as a symbol for the new covenant in his blood that was mentioned in Jeremiah 31:31 through 34. Now, in verse 12, it says, "Return." This whole chapter has to say something to the returning exiles, as well as foreshadowing future events. Return, imperative, encouragement for them to return. You who have no hope. Well, it looked bad, but God is saying, I'm in control of history, trust me. And then the next part, to this day I'm declaring that I will restore double to you. Now, some see this as the inheritance of the firstborn. Others see it as allusion to Jeremiah's, where it says they'll receive double judgment. Which it is, I don't know. Now, before I leave verse 11, I've set your prisoners free from the waterless pit. Roman Catholicism uses this as a proof text for purgatory, but basically that comes from the Shepherd of Hermas, a book that most Protestants don't accept as canonical. Here it's just a metaphor for saving someone's life. Okay? Now, in verse 13, "And I will bend the bow of Judah as my bow, and I will fill the bow of Ephraim." They're going to be united again. "And I will stir up your sons, O Zion, against the sons." Now, you have Greece. It's the word Javan. It's used of Greece in Daniel 8:21, Daniel 10:20, and Joel 3:6. Here it seems to be used as a sense of distant peoples, not meaning just the Greeks, but maybe distant peoples. And it's used that way in Genesis 10:2 and 4, and Isaiah 66:19. This is where the Broadman commentary says it refers to the reign of Josiah, and these refer to Greek mercenaries hired by Egypt. But that seems a bit much to me. Verse 14, we're going to blow the Zophar, the trumpet, used for military and priestly functions to initiate God's coming. The storm wind from the south, this possibly refers to coming, the Sinaitic covenant, or the idea of God's presence affecting nature. You might want to see 2 Kings 2:14, Isaiah 29:6, Ezekiel 1:4, Ezekiel 13:11 and 13. Okay? Notice the sling stones mentioned in verse 15. This is a metaphor of God's military victory over these enemies. And the sling stones, I think, are mentioned again in verse 16, where it says, "the stones of the crown." This seems to be in a parallel relationship with the sling stones. And verse 17, of course, speaks of social stability. Now, when you come to verse 10, it seems to me that verse 1 of chapter 10 ought to go with chapter 9. It mentioned this economic flourishment as a sign of God's presence and a renewed covenant. Well, verse 1 seems to say the word ask is an imperative. The time of rain was often attributed to Baal. But Yahweh says, I'm the one that gave that to you. Now, famine was a part of the covenant blessing and cursing of Deuteronomy 27 through 29. But in Deuteronomy 11, 13 through 14, the curse is now gone because of their believing, and that may be an allusion to this here. Now, in verse 2, we have for, but really it should be the word but, which closely links it to what goes before. This is the way it has been. This is the way it's going to be, maybe the relation of these chapters. The teraphim speaks iniquity. Now, the teraphim are the household idols, sometimes small, sometimes very large, because one was put in the bed to look like King David when he snuck out, so they could be little or big. They're mentioned in Genesis 31:19, 31:34 and 35, Judges 17:5, 18:14 and following, 2 Kings 23:24, Hosea 3:4, 1 Samuel 15:23, 19, 13, and 16. It's in your outline. You can see them there, the teraphim. Now, the diviners mean to divide. And they are, of course, condemned in Deuteronomy 18:9 through 13, 1 Samuel 15:23. Sometimes they use natural phenomena and sometimes man-made phenomena. They would use the liver of sheep, birds, and stars, or they would throw arrows, cast like dice, or read tea leaves. And so they did both natural phenomenon and man-made. And tell false dreams. Now, false dreams are spoken of in Deuteronomy 13:1 through 5 as a sign of a true prophet. And you also see them in Jeremiah 29:8-9 and Ezekiel 22:28. There were true revelations and dreams, but there were also false dreams. Now, They comfort in vain. Now, this is the idea from the root idle. It means nothingness. It seems to refer to the prophet in Jeremiah's day. You might want to see 23:32 or Jeremiah 27, 9 and 10. Therefore the peoples wander like sheep, and they are afflicted because there is no shepherd. Now, the people as sheep is an allusion going back to Numbers 27:17. God as shepherd goes back to Genesis 49:24, and certainly can be seen in the beautiful Psalms 23. Now, the evil shepherds are mentioned in the beginning of verse 3. Ezekiel 34 describes the leaders of Israel, both religious and civil, as false shepherds, and that's the idea here. Matter of fact, this idea of the king as a shepherd is an ancient custom. We found it in Egyptian documents over 2000 BC, and also in the title to the Code of Hammurabi, where he considers himself to be a shepherd. It later becomes, of course, a messianic title for Jesus in John 10. Now, the male goats are a reference to these false leaders. And then it says in verse 3, for the Lord of hosts has visited his flock, the house of Judah. Now, the word visited used in verse 3 is in a positive sense. It is also used of the Exodus, Genesis 50:24 and Exodus 3:16, 4:31, and 13:19. He's going to visit for blessing. It can mean blessing or cursing, but context seems to imply blessing. And he will make them like his majestic horse in battle. They've turned from cowering sheep to war horses. That's what God's grace can do to a people. That's what he's going to do to them. Now in verse 4 it says, for them will come from them. Now the Masoretic text says, from him. Now the Targums make this very messianic. Verse 4 seems to be referring to the leaders of Judah, but of course it may be the ultimate leader who will come out of Judah. All right? The Targums make this King Messiah, which is so significant, because the words cornerstone are messianic. You might want to see Judges 20, verse 2, Isaiah 19:13, Isaiah 28:16, Psalms 118:22. Now the tent peg is also a messianic reference. It means to enlarge the domain. You might want to see Isaiah 22:22 and 23. The bow in battle is a military metaphor of strength. You might want to see Exodus 15:3. There's a play on the word ruler here. It means oppressor, and it's used in Zechariah 9:8 for a physical depressor. But here it seems to be used of the godly leader who will one day come, this messianic king. Let's see. They will fight, for the Lord will be with them. This is the ideal of holy war we see so often in Joshua and Judges. Notice that in verse 6 where it says, and I shall bring them back. Notice the house of Joseph. Now, this also goes by Ephraim and Samaria and Israel in the ancient parts of the historical books of the Bible. It seems to be about the reuniting of Judah and Ephraim into one people. I will bring them back. Now, some manuscripts of the Masoretic text and the Septuagint have make them dwell. Now, the rabbis say it's ambiguous because it refers to both elements. Notice in verse 6 where it says, for I am the Lord their God, and I will answer them. The covenant's renewed. He'll heal their prayers. He'll respond. Look at verse 7. And Ephraim will be like a mighty man. The thoughts develop from verses 7 and 12. And their heart will be glad as from wine. Psalms 104:15 says, wine is a gift of God that gladdens the hearts of men. Twice in the New Testament, God's people were accused of drinking wine when they were really filled with the Spirit. Now we'll see Acts 2:13 and 15 and Ephesians 5:18. Notice where it says, indeed their children will see it and be glad. This is another allusion to social stability like the last verse of verse 9. Notice it says, and I will whistle for them. Now this seems to be an allusion to a shepherd's unique call for his sheep. You might see Judges 5:16. This whistling is mentioned in a slightly different context in Isaiah 5:26, 7:18, and 19. You might want to look those up. For I have redeemed them. What a beautiful word. To buy back from slavery, to redeem from the slave market or a prisoner of war. That's what God will do for us. And they'll be as numerous as they were before. This is an allusion to the Abrahamic covenant of Genesis 13:16 and 15:5. I will scatter, no, I will sow, idea of a purpose for a harvest. And they will remember me. See Deuteronomy 8:18. Notice Egypt and Assyria, traditional enemies, but now they're going to be brought in. Gilead and Lebanon, we're going to have to expand the room for the people of God. There's going to be so many. Look at the end of verse 10. And then in verse 11, notice 11 and 12 in my New American Standard have all caps. The authors believe it's referring to Yahweh or the Messiah. You can refer to either one, but I think it's a messianic passage. And he will pass through the sea of distress. Now this can refer to the Messiah or Yahweh. The Septuagint, following the Septuagint, which is followed in the Revised Standard Version, have they will pass through the narrow sea. But the Jerusalem Bible and has the Sea of Egypt, but there's no textual support of that, referring to the exile here. Notice it says in verse 12, "And I shall strengthen them in the Lord, and his name they will walk, declares the Lord." Now there seems to be two different people mentioned here. I think it's messianic. As they had trusted in Baals, now they're trusting in God. And that seems to be the way this chapter concludes. Now we're just beginning this. I wish I could be more specific on these, but the time element's ambiguous. It may be past history, far past, current, just barely in the prophet's day, a little bit in the future, Maccabean, Jesus' day, or end-time events. Maybe it's ambiguous so it fits every age. I don't know. But these are wonderful passages used so often in the gospel to describe Jesus, which seems to imply it certainly was fulfilled in the Roman period. But it goes beyond that, and I think it's going to be fulfilled in an eschatological sense. So read your commentary and pray through this. Don't get real dogmatic. Try to find the metaphors linked to other parts of the Old Testament. Either like the Mosaic covenants, very important, the prophets' use of these terms, and we're just going to have to stay a little fluid through here because we can't be real dogmatic. Well, I've really enjoyed being with you. I hope you'll read through this, outline it in your own words, and try to see how it fits to the first 8 chapters, how it applies to the life of Jesus, and yet how it's going to fit the end time. But remember, it's got to be applicable to the people who return from the exile. That's the central focus of the historical context, though it means much more. God bless you. Have a good day. I'll see you again, same time, same place next week.